Good morning. This is our, I'm not sure, 10th or 11th or 12th book signing for women who are mostly women who are our customers. And most recently, we have had Lynn Olson do Nine God's War, which is about the woman who ran the largest spy network in France during the Second World War. So it sort of relates. By the way, and our next book signing is about, it's Gucci, and the woman who wrote the book is Sarah Forden, who's now at Bloomberg, reporting on high tech, and she spent 15 years in Milan and studied and reported on the fashion industry and wrote the book on Gucci, which is about the rise of the company and the fall of the family, so to speak. So, and there's a movie coming out at the beginning of November with Lady Gaga playing the wife. So that would be totally different. So I'm really pleased today to introduce one of my husband's favorite people and one of my favorite people. My husband has known her husband for many, many years, and so I'm particularly pleased who's here. Foer is here. So I'm particularly pleased. And Esther's book was named one of the best books of the year by NPR, and is the National Book Awards finalist. So I'll give you a
National Jewish Book Award. Let's limit the category. I would rather, yeah.
So Esther Safran Foer is the author of I Want You to Know We Are Still Here. When her mother was, I think, 19, in May or June of 1941, she was living in Kolki, Poland, and saw the parachutes of the Germans coming. And she'd been a member of the Communist Party, and so she realized that that was not going to be a good thing. So she went home, got her coat with a friend. They walked what I calculated is 2,600 miles if you do it straight, to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, spent the war there, and of course when they came back, there was no one left. So the 2,600 miles I calculated is the same distance as Washington to Los Angeles. So you can imagine doing that, and that's just the beginning of, well, it's not the beginning of this story, but it's very relevant. And so Esther wanted to know more about the family, more about the place, more about the history, because she had certain memories, and her mother said certain things, but she wanted to know more. Esther herself was born in Lodz, Poland, in a displaced persons camp, and she came to the U.S. in 1949. She worked for presidential candidate George McGovern. She founded a public relations firm, and she served as executive director of Six and I Synagogue Center in Washington, D.C. until 2016. For those of you who don't know Six and I, it is a synagogue and a cultural center. So it has many musical lectures, books, and it's a whole cultural center. Bert, I will introduce, is a lawyer, and he founded the American Antitrust Institute. And they happen to have three boys, whom some of you may know. And Jonathan Safran Foer is working on the book about Biden's first 100 days.
No, that's Frank Foer.
That's Frank. Oh, I know that. Among other books that he's written. And she has, Jonathan is a novelist, and Joshua is also an author.
Right.
Moonwalking with Einstein is one of his books. Now we turn to Judge Judy, and she is recently retired and is now senior judge at the D.C. Superior Court, where she served as presiding judge of the Civil Division. She's also served in the Criminal and Family Divisions and as presiding judge of the Domestic Violence Unit. She's an adjunct professor of law at American University. So this should be quite interesting. I'm going to start with asking Esther a question that her granddaughter asked her. And that is, how will I know who these people are?
Okay, that's a good question. I have to say, as I do this, I'm really, first of all, thrilled to be doing this in Nina's store, where I love wearing her jackets. They get me through a whole lot of complicated situations. and doing this with my friend Judy Bartonoff. One of the things about this, my book came out in March 2020, right as Zoom Zoom hit me, right as COVID was hitting. And I've done book talks all over the country, almost all of them Zoom. So I'm so glad to be here with you in person. But one of the things I found, because I was doing so many and I could select the interviewer, sometimes it was a dear friend, I did it with all three of my sons, different interviews. And then I thought, well, this would be fun. I'm going to do my oldest granddaughter, who lives in Washington, goes to GDS, where our sons went and where I know some of your kids went. And each interview brought out not only a different part of the book, but taught me something about my children, and in this case, my granddaughter. Some of the interviews were very intellectual and focusing on facts. Some were very emotional. Sadie, our oldest granddaughter, has now told me she's going to be the family historian. And in a way, she kind of helped drive this process because we were sitting in my home office, which one of my sons calls Grandma's Playroom. And it has boxes that are labeled by family groups. Both sides of my family, both sides of Bert's family. And I know who's in all those boxes. I can pick up the pictures and tell you who everyone is. But I haven't labeled them. And my granddaughter Sadie looked at me and she said, "But Grandma, how will I know who these people are?" And I realized I had to tell her the story. So that was part of the motivation for doing the book. It was a good time in my life. A lot of pieces of information had come together. And I was at a point in my life where I knew that I had to share those stories and pass them on if they were going to be remembered into future generations. So that's how Sadie was part of the motivator. And she had a great time. We did a podcast together, which was just, I recommend doing conversations with your grandchildren or your kids. It was really wonderful for both of us.
Well, let me start. You've already answered the first two questions I was going to ask you.
Okay.
But much about this book is about the search for the family that had hidden your father. Mm-hmm. But you also start by talking about your mother, who was quite a formidable woman. And yes. Nina has talked a little bit about her, but can you tell us a little bit more about her and about what she did and what happened to her during the war?
Well, she's my father committed suicide when I was 8, so I know very little about his background. My mother lived until she was almost 99, spending the last 3 years of her life in our house, something that she had planned, but we didn't realize she had planned. And she was a force. She was a tiny little woman, but she was absolutely a force. And when I look back on things I've done, I realized I'm a strong woman because she was a strong woman, and she passed that on to me. And I hope that I'll be able to pass that on to my granddaughters. She never looked back. With everything that she went through, she was always moving forward. Whether it was when the Nazis, well, probably when she joined the communists. She says she wasn't really a communist. She used to say, "I believed in equal rights for people." And that was the message she gave to her grandchildren. But she had a record. She'd been jailed. And throughout her life, it was always about, how do I move forward? The Nazis are coming down, the parachutes are coming, they're rolling into town. And she's like, I'm getting out of here. And she went to her house, packed in June, and what was interesting, she took her winter coat. It was not a Nina, unfortunately, and she took a pair of scissors because she knew how to sew. And I don't know what was going through her mind, but she was thinking ahead. She was thinking it might get cold. She really expected to come back in a couple of weeks. But just in case, she was prepared. And the scissors in the coat saved her. She said she had to cut the coat and sew different pieces of it onto various parts of her clothing. She had a pair of pants that had somehow a hollow opening when she would steal potatoes in fields where there was nothing to eat as she's running across the Soviet Union. She'd slip the potatoes down her pants so that nobody would notice. And I recently, and then of course, we come to the United States and here everything's going to be better, and then my father's gone, and she had to move on again. And I don't remember her anything but her moving forward. And I remember as a little girl sitting with her at our apartment building where we moved immediately after my father died and looking for four-leaf clovers. And I still have them. One of my sons, I have 2 sheets. I would tape them on carefully to a sheet. And one of my sons recently said, "Can I have one of them?" And so, of course, I gave it to him, and I have the other one. But I realized it was all about looking for luck. It wasn't, she wasn't feeling sorry for herself. She probably was. But she was trying to figure out what the next step was and not looking back.
One of the most moving parts of the book, and there are many, is when you learned that your father had been married before and that you had a half-sister who was killed with her mother and other family members. How did you come to learn about them?
So my mother, it was this strong little woman. It was a very controlled story. She told me what she wanted to tell me, when she wanted to tell me. But sometimes things slipped out. And I was already a mother of 3 sons. I was over at her house, probably getting ready to take her on one of her shopping expeditions because she cut coupons and we'd have to divide up who was going to take her to which stores because none of us were going to go to all the stores the coupons were clipped from. And she's drinking coffee and we're chatting, and I very cautiously and delicately would ask her questions. One thing that's characteristic of Holocaust survivor families is secrets and not trying to impinge on those secrets, asking questions carefully so as to give her space to answer when she wanted to. And I asked her a question about my father, and she said, "Oh, he left when his wife and daughter were killed." And I'm like, "You're kidding me. You're telling me this now as an adult, as the mother of 3 sons?" And I said, "So tell me more. What do you know? What were their names?" And she had a way of ending a conversation. She would say in Yiddish, "Genug schon," it's enough. And that's it. You know, when she said that, we were done. But I couldn't let go of that. I mean, I had a half-sister who I didn't know about, who was murdered. As a baby, I didn't know what. And the one piece of information I had, the best clue, was a picture of my father with the family that my mother thought had hidden him for part of the war. And in our family, we always thought, well, what if we go to Ukraine and we find them? Actually, we thought we were going to Poland because she was born in Poland. But it's a part of the world that changed hands 8 times between the First and Second War, so you were never sure where you were going. To follow in her footsteps, her Polish footsteps, I had to go to Ukraine. And I guess that was kind of the impetus for our middle son's book, Everything is Illuminated. He was a rising senior with a minor in creative writing, and he had a thesis he had to do. And he was like, I really want to spend the summer in Europe. That was his first thinking, you know, not this is what I'm passionately trying to write. And what do I do? And I said, what if you take this picture that we have of your grandfather, and while you're in Prague with your friend hanging out, go to Ukraine and see if you can find them. And he bought onto the idea, and he went, and he found absolutely nothing. That was the bad news. The good news is the book became an international bestseller and then a movie. And because of that, people started to call me and they'd go, you know, this book, these were people whose families came from these villages. They'd say, I can't believe he wrote this about our village. And I'd have to say, well, you know, it's fiction, it's a novel. But they really
He changed
weren't.
the name, right?
Pardon?
It's Truggenbrod, but he actually changed the name in the novel.
But,
Sort
you know,
of.
only slightly. And he used his own name. I mean, he used real names, which I guess is magical realism, which these people didn't quite understand. So people started to call me and complain, but they also said, but I know the real story. And I got tidbits of the real story that I was able to put together.
So Jonathan goes to, at your suggestion, Jonathan eventually goes to Truggenbrod, where you thought your father had lived, and there's nothing there anymore. So he makes it up,
Right.
basically, and that leads to the book. What did you later learn that made you able to find the right place?
Oh, I learned so many things. When I would travel, and we've been lucky enough to travel, and we have family in Brazil and in Israel, and actually also Bert and I went along as babysitters when Jonathan did his international book tour. And people would come up to him and they'd give him a card and say, my family comes from Kolk, or, you know, my family comes from Trochenbrod. And Jonathan would come back to the hotel room where we were sitting with our precious 6-month-old grandson, and he'd say, I'm done with this story. If you want to follow up? And I did. I started to follow up. And in Israel, after a long day of searching, late into the night, I found somebody who knew my father, who knew the shtetl, the village he came from, who was able to tell me his wife's name, who was able to describe my father to me. This is the first person I had met who knew my father as a young adult, growing up with his first family. It was an absolutely incredible evening. She wanted me to come back and spend a week with her, and I regret that I didn't. But she gave me all these clues, including the name of his wife, and including the name of the village he lived in. The other really important clue that I learned in the process was I was looking for my father, Louis Safran, although I knew his Yiddish name was Label. And I'd ask people, well, did you know Louis? Did you know Label? And in these villages, people had nicknames, and that's how they were known. They were known by their nicknames. And my father's nickname, you know, they were known by a physical feature. There was somebody who was an albino and somebody who, I got to hear all sorts of incredible descriptions. Usually it was tied to a physical description or a place or a member of their family. In my father's case, it was tied to the village he lived in. And that became the clue that opened the story.
So in 2009, you and your son Frank traveled to Ukraine, and you found the answers to many of your questions.
I did.
And can you tell us a little bit about that and about finally finding the family that had saved your father?
So in 2009, having sent Jonathan on this journey 10 years earlier, having been absorbed with raising my family, doing the various things I was doing professionally, it was just time. In a way, I didn't have any excuses anymore. My kids like to joke that I was using child labor to do what I should have done. That I was using, Frank was the first one to interview my mother in depth. And he did it over 6 weeks for a paper that he had to write at GDS. And he did it, he would take her to her grocery stores and buy all the bargains with a tape recorder between them. And there we got part of the story. And then, of course, Jonathan takes this trip to Ukraine at my urging. But it was clear it was time for me to step up and...
Now, I take it your mother was not happy that he took that trip.
My mother, it was hard to figure. I hired researchers, I hired an FBI agent, I did all sorts of things, all of which was reasonably easy compared to having to tell my mother that I was going to Ukraine. I was having to tell her that I was going where her family was murdered. And in her mind, it was still a terrible, dangerous place. And I finally said, you know, I'm going to take this trip. I'm going to Ukraine. I'm going with some other people. Part of our trip was joined on to a trip of other people from some of the villages our family came from. And she yelled at me and she said, "How can you do this to me?" I was doing this to her. And I said, "Well, you know, it's okay. Frank's coming with me. You know, he's a grown-up. He's a journalist." She said, "You're taking your son?" And then she said, "He has babies." And in writing the book, I realized, and by the way, she called me the next day and said, "Try to understand where my fears are coming from." I mean, she was strong and she was also really smart. But in writing the book and in thinking about this, she left her mother without saying goodbye. Mm-hmm. And I was leaving her to go to this awful place. So yes, so we went. We boarded a Lufthansa flight. And the interesting thing when we talk about how this place changed names, we flew from... You were in the airport.
Right. We were in the airport. I was wrong, actually. I thought we were on our way to New Mexico, but we weren't. We were on our way to Europe. But we saw Esther and Frank at Dulles Airport, and what I remember most is Esther saying, "We're going to find the place that Jonathan didn't find. We're going to find the real place."
Right.
So you knew already.
So we ran into Judy and Jean in Dulles. They were off to Europe. We took a flight from Dulles to Munich, and we get to Munich, and we're going to fly into Lviv, whatever it was called, depending on who the occupying force was. And we're looking at the board, and so where's the flight to Lviv? And we couldn't find it. So we went to the information desk, and we said, "Oh, well, where's the flight to Lviv?" And the woman says, "Lviv? I don't know if we fly there." She says, "Tel Aviv?" And we said, no, Lviv. And then she says, "Oh, Lemberg." The Germans called it Lemberg, and at that time it was still Lemberg to them. So Frank and I boarded this flight, not knowing what we'd find. Really, I expected to find very, very little, and spent a lot of time managing my expectations, expecting that, you know, I will now have done this trip, and I could move on. And as I mentioned earlier, I hired somebody who in the media world would be called a fixer, somebody who would do advance work, who would go to the villages, see if there was anybody to talk to. It's a lovely young woman. She found the oldest people in each of the villages. And in each of the villages, we found tidbits of our family story. People confirmed things that we knew, told us new things that we didn't know. And ultimately, we went to this tiny village where my father had lived with his wife and daughter. And I mean, you have to read the book, but it was
to read the book.
it was them. And I kept sitting there and saying to Frank, "This cannot be real." And at one point he said to me, 110% real.
Now, one of the things I thought was really interesting was that you went to this former FBI agent.
Sure.
And one of the things he told you, because one question was, does the person in this picture, is it the same person as in that picture? And can you tell us a little bit about some of what he told you to help you figure it out?
So, you know, I was into I was willing to try anything. I was going all the way to Ukraine, and a friend of ours, and I don't know if anybody here, John Cuneo, who's yes, Sally knows him, and you know him. John and Mara were at our house, and I was telling anybody the story who would listen, and showing them the pictures that I had, the picture I had, and the pictures that this woman I hired in Ukraine had found in the home of what she thought was the family that had hidden my father. And I was trying to match the figures and pictures, and I showed them to John. I said, what do you think? And John said, I know an FBI agent, a forensic photography expert. And he gave me the phone number. So I called this guy, and the guy said, it's $250 an hour and you're wasting your money because I cannot give you a positive ID from this picture from then. And he'd handled all sorts of high-profile FBI cases. And I went there and we looked at the picture and we looked at distance between various features to try to match them up. And at the end of it, he said, I can't tell you it's them, but I can't tell you it's not them. But he said, look, here, let me give you a clue. Look at the clothes. First of all, look at the faces facing in the same direction, you know, not sideways so that you could. But he said, look at the clothes. These people didn't have a lot of clothes. And if they were having their picture taken, there's a chance it was in the same clothes. And that ultimately was the key clue.
So how and where did your parents meet? And how did they end up in Washington, D.C.?
Okay, so my parents met after the war. My mother went home to her shtetl, to her village. She and her friend had saved money. They wanted to have new clothes because they were going back to see their family. And of course, there was nobody there. Not only was there nobody there, but she saw somebody walking across the street in her sister's dress. Her house had been burned down, but she recognized it from there was some sort of a mill in the backyard, and she saw part of that sticking up. And I don't know my father's story. But Jews were starting to gather. These were survivors who had either been in the partisans or had been hidden in the Soviet Union or in the Polish-Ukrainian woods. And they started to gather in larger and larger cities. And the next largest city was Lutsk, where my parents met. I remember my mother saying, they put us all in one big apartment building, and there were so many empty buildings. But the Jewish Agency was trying to keep people together and trying to help figure out what to do with them next. And somehow from Lutsk, they went to Lodz, which was then the largest city in Poland, the most populated city, because Warsaw had been totally leveled and there was nothing in Warsaw. And in May of 1945, they got married. I have the ketubah. My mother had saved it. And it turned out that they were married on Lag BaOmer, which is the one time in the Jewish New Year, and during that period when you can get married by a rabbi. And I can imagine how many Jews who were survivors, who had lost everything, were waiting for that day to get married. That was May of 45. March of 46, I was born. I was born in Lodz. My parents lived in a very nice apartment that had pictures on the wall and tablecloths on the table that had belonged to another family that didn't come back. And my father had a business with several partners, and the business was, my mother described it as kind of a bar, a cafe, but I met one of his partners in Brazil who said, well, actually, what we did was change money. Lodz was the crossroads of Europe then. People coming from the east trying to figure out where they were going. They had currency from, Uzbekistan, let's say, and they had to change it into German currency or wherever they were going. And so their business was a bar on the surface, and I understand from his partner they gave lots of drinks to the local police. And in the back, they would calculate the currency exchange. And my mother told me she even went with money strapped on her belt, on her waist, inside, on some sort of a belt, from Lodz to Kyiv to exchange currencies. And I said, weren't you scared? She said, well, the only thing that scared her is there was a guy sitting next to her and she was afraid he was going to touch her and find out what she had. But somehow she came back and had exchanged the money. But that was my mother. She was gutsy.
And then they end up in the DP camp.
So, Lodz was, there were agents from the Jewish agencies from Israel who said, you cannot stay here. There were pogroms going on in Poland. Jews were killed after the war. And these people came and said, you've got to get out. You've got to get out now. My father's partners went to Italy and then to Brazil. They were single men. We were a family of three. So one day my mother packed just a few things and told the neighbors we were just going away for the weekend or whatever. And my father went to work and left the store and met us. And they had hired smugglers to take us across the border from Poland to Germany, because Germany was the exit point. That was how you get out of Europe, or Italy. There were a couple of destinations that would that offer the opportunity to go west. And apparently it was a false bottom truck. My mother said she had to put rags, I'm sure it was clean, in my mouth to keep me from crying during the most dangerous parts of the trip. And we made it to Berlin and ultimately ended up in a displaced persons camp in Ziegenheim, Germany. And from there tried to go to Brazil, where my mother had a large family, but we couldn't get into Brazil. In fact, I mean, you can look at the refugee crisis right now. We couldn't get in anywhere. Nobody wanted Jewish refugees. There were 250 to 300,000 Jewish refugees after the war, after the murder of 6 million people. And nobody wanted us. There's, I quote, a Canadian legislator who said, none is too many. And ultimately, we couldn't get into Brazil. My uncle had offered to pay the transport, to do everything, and he said he couldn't do it. My mother's uncle. And ultimately, we came to the United States under the 1948 DP Immigration Act, which was blatantly anti-Semitic. It was going to allow 200,000 displaced persons into the United States, but there were all sorts of qualifiers. They wanted, and Congress knew exactly what it was doing when it was writing the act. They wanted displaced persons. Are you getting ready to ask me a question? I see my husband writing in the front row.
He can't help himself.
Chance to find out what really happened.
They wanted, you had to have been in Germany by December of 1945. The war had just ended. Most of the Jewish survivors who weren't in concentration camps near Germany had done what my parents had done. They'd gone east. They didn't have enough time to get to Germany by December of 45. But that led to falsified documents.
Right. I was going to ask you, you've talked about having 2 birthdays.
I
So
have
can
2
you explain that?
birthdays because my birth certificate and all of my documents, my health documents, my employment documents, have the wrong birthday on it because we came to the United States I have a birth certificate that says I was born in Ziegenheim, Germany in September of 1946. Well, I wasn't. I was born in Lodz, Poland 6 months earlier. But if my parents had said that, it would have been clear that they hadn't been in Germany by December of 45. The other thing is under the 48 Immigration Act, they wanted, I don't know if it's 30 to 40% to be farmers. Yeah, right. And I have in my possession a document that certifies my father as a first-class farmer. So, you know, there were ways to do things. So of the 200,000 displaced people allowed into the U.S. under the 1948 Immigration Act, a little over 50,000 were Jews. And in fact, it's estimated that about 10,000 were Nazis. The war was over. The American government were looking for people who could help them fight the Cold War. So things had changed. Immigration, it changed. There was a 1950 Immigration Act. People realized what happened. Truman didn't even want to sign this 48 Act, knowing how blatantly anti-Semitic it was. But he signed it so that some people could get in, and there were another group of people that were able to get in under the 1950 Act.
So you've now finished and published the book. Are you finished with your research, or is there still more? And
Well,
if so,
you-
what is it?
You never finish. You never, ever finish. And one of the things I did was I did DNA on 23andMe, I did all of them. I mean, what the heck, you know? And relatives keep turning up. I have a wonderful second cousin. My mother had a first cousin she didn't know, a man who is, it was a generational difference. He's our age, my age. And he's the son of her uncle, who my mother said, but Uncle Max never got married. And then she said, oh. And, and they're wonderful people. We've met a number of times, and these people keep cropping up. I've found a few more. I have a family reunion next week here with some cousins who I didn't know. Somebody out on the West Coast read my book and called her sister and said, you got to read this book. Their names you're going to recognize.
So you talk.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, she came and met me, and now she's organized a reunion of her cousins with us.
So you actually talk in the book about the significance of names.
Right.
And of learning the name of the half-sister you never knew, and about naming other relatives who were lost. It was very helpful at the end of the book to have a little bit of a family tree. But why are names so important?
Which, by the way, was improved in the paperback. I got some pushback. There wasn't quite enough in the hardback.
Because I wanted more, in the hardback, I wanted more people, I wanted more names on that tree.
Well, I'll show you how it changed. It added last names. You know, how do you remember people? My editor at one point, and there's some edits between the first edition and the second, said there are names in here that don't mean, that don't connect to the story. And I said, we can't take them out. This is the only place these people exist. They don't have graves. This is really important to me. And of course, names were important in figuring out where my father was because of the nicknames. Mm-hmm. But in the Jewish tradition, children are named for deceased relatives. I'm named for my 2 murdered grandmothers. Great story. My brother is named for our 2 murdered grandfathers. He was born in the United States, and their names were Israel Yosef. And he was born, we'd already been in the U.S. for over a year, and my mother talked to the most American cousin she could find. It was actually a cousin of a cousin, and said, I need an American name for this child. It has to go with Israel Yosef. My brother's name is Julian Edwin. But he carries the Hebrew name. And our children, our youngest son, Josh, has the name of my mother's sister, Pesha. Mm-hmm. But of course, I didn't know about my half-sister. I didn't know her name. And our 2 youngest grandchildren, Leo, who's 8, is named after my father. And our youngest granddaughter, she's 4. When she was born, our son called us in the middle of the night, and he said, you have a beautiful new granddaughter. And her great-grandmother had just died. He said, we're going to name her for her great-grandmother B. And he said, I need to call you in the morning. And he called in the morning, and he said, would it be okay if her middle name was after your sister, Asya? And this beautiful little child walks around Boston, Brookline, and she says, I'm B. Asya. She somehow understands that name, that her whole name is important. And she will carry it forward and do things that her great aunt never did.
So anybody who's been to your house knows that on the mantle in the living room are lots of little jars of dirt and pebbles. And there's another place in the kitchen where there are even more of them. What inspired you to collect pebbles and dirt?
So, I mean, if you happen to my house and you haven't realized what that is, it looks a little like an art installation. I've gotten very nice jars, and they're all matching and lined up very attractively. But when I went to Ukraine, I wanted to bring something back. And what do you bring back from this place? So I brought back dirt from each of the mass graves and that my family's buried, and that meant going to several mass graves. And then when my mother died the night before, I realized that I had the dirt from the mass grave where her mother was buried, and I took part of that to the cemetery and buried it with her.
Now, you also buried your family's Rosh Hashanah card
Right.
in the mass graves. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So that's really the book, the title of the book, which I kept thinking about shortening, making it catchier. I want you to know we're still here. In addition to taking something back, I wanted to leave something behind. Now, I was leaving it in, in these rural places, in some places, some of the towns where nothing existed. But I decided to bring copies of our annual Jewish New Year's card, which has our whole family in it. And in the book, you'll see one of those cards is in the book. The one that's in the book has 14 people in it. It has my mother, it has our sons, it has our grandchildren. And that's become kind of an obsession of mine, this card, because I see my family growing. And I decided that's what I wanted to leave behind. And with a borrowed fork from the hotel, Frank and I went to each of the mass graves, and we said Kaddish, the Jewish prayer, and we buried this card. And, in the dirt of Ukraine. I mean, why? But to me, symbolically, it was important to say, my grandmothers went to their graves. They were murdered thinking nobody had survived, but we did. And so I like to think of this as a book that's, looking back on it, that's not just about tragedy. It's about gratitude and redemption.
You talked about how your mother could be really outspoken and forthright, but she also kept a lot of secrets.
Right.
And on the other hand, you and your three sons are all storytellers.
Right.
And in his own way, I think your husband Bert tells pretty good stories too. And you say in the book that storytelling is fundamental to resilience. You talk about that in describing the elaborate 4 Passover Seders, which can include costumes and plays and other complicated preparations, which you call an opportunity to keep memory alive. What do you think made you a storyteller? And what, if anything, did you do to encourage your children to be storytellers?
I just, one of our sons was asked in an interview, how come you're all writers? Our sons are all writers, and I see the mother of one of our son's classmates who's here, whose son is also a writer. And the flip response from one of my sons at an event at Georgetown Day School was, you didn't teach us how to do anything else. But in fact, memories are really important in our household. Passover is a way to Passover is all about memory keeping. It's about visualizing yourself in the story, not the whole continuum of history, but visualizing yourself in that specific story. And one of our sons, that's what I was going to say in an interview, they said, so how do you account for the creativity? What was your family doing? And he said, it's all about the Passover Seder. Mm-hmm. It's not really, but storytelling and memories are really important. And in writing the book and in doing some of the reading and the research, I read several wonderful books by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. And he says Jews are a people of memory, not history. That you read the Bible, you think about Passover, it's about those individual stories of people interacting. And that's what we do.
Is there anything about the story that you didn't include in the book and you now wish you had?
Oh, I wish I'd had more time to write it, but I had deadlines. but I'm so grateful I did it, and I encourage all of you not to necessarily write a book, but to tell your stories to your children. Put them on, put them on two sheets of paper. But it is something that they will value and that will make them better people.
And now that you've finished this one, can we expect a next book?
Something, I don't know what. So I can have a chance to come back here.
Okay. Nina, do you have some other questions for people?
I have some questions from the audience, and then we will open it up. But I have one thing that I want you to say or explain. And I want you to know we're still here. Who is that message for?
Yeah, well, it has a lot of different meanings. As I said, when I buried this card in the mass graves, we're still here. That was the most literal meaning of it. But I think it has lots of meanings on both a global and a very specific
Can you explain
scale.
a little more, Esther, about who's the you and who's the we?
Well, in the literal you, it was these mass graves, my grandmother's. And the we was our family. But I think you can take a much larger, draw a much larger meaning from it.
So the next question is, can you talk about the Ukrainians who tried to protect members of the Jewish community?
So I have to say I went to Ukraine. I wasn't sure what it would be like, but of course we were there for 10 days. And, I brought gifts, and I had a wonderful researcher and driver, but I was paying them, I think, like what was the equivalent of a year's salary in Ukraine. But they were wonderful people and did so much advance work. My driver in one of the villages we went to climbed the fire tower so that he could get pictures for me of the whole village. I didn't run into anti-Semitism, but we were there. I hope that, the parliament, is it the parliament that just passed a law outlawing anti-Semitism in Ukraine or anti-Semitic thought? And the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, is Jewish. My first meal there with several Ukrainians, and Frank said it was like I was dropping a bomb. I said, we understand that there's a lot of anti-Semitism here. And they were like, oh, no. But the part of Ukraine that we went to, which was Poland, is the most anti-Semitic part. The part that's closer to Russia is a lot less anti-Semitic. The family, however, was wonderful. They kept we didn't do anything. Our grandfather did something. Why are you thanking us?
This was the family who...
Hid my father.
Are there any Jewish people any survivors, who stayed in Ukraine? And what are their living conditions? What are their issues?
So, I met a woman who came from my father's shtetl. She was a partisan. She was a fighter. She married a Christian partisan, stayed in Lutsk, raised a family there, and her grandson is now training to be a rabbi, actually, to run the synagogue in Lutsk. Mm-hmm. So there are a few that stayed. We also went to Friday night services in Lutsk, and what we met there were mostly Russian immigrants who had moved to Ukraine from Russia. So I think there are a few. The president, and some of the oligarchs.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What's your opinion of modern democracy and the new voting restrictions being organized? This is totally...
Oh, my God.
And can you relate these restrictions now to what was and to possible larger restrictions on the horizon, potentially growing further?
Can we talk
How much time
later?
do we have?
I'm obviously against any voting restrictions. I'm against the Texas abortion law. As I said earlier, as I see these immigrants on the border, and we certainly can't take everybody in, but I my heart goes out to each of those children, and, but by the grace of God, that could have been me. So we can talk later, but that's a very short answer to a very complicated question.
I have a plug, actually, for another book, which if anybody hasn't read East West Street, when you said Limburg, two of the people who
Right.
came from that area were became lawyers, and one developed the concept of crimes against humanity,
Right.
and the other developed the concept of genocide.
Thank you.
And they were both prominently figured, but both of these concepts prominently figured in the Nuremberg trials. But the book is fascinating. It's
real.
by Philippe Sands, and it's called East West Street. But it's also
Right.
in that area, which is
Right.
amazing. Okay, questions from other questions.
Oh, Don.
Mr. Baker.
Is the part of Ukraine that you were in basically Ukrainian speaking or basically Russian speaking?
Basically Ukrainian, but there was Russian. My driver was Russian, and I didn't hear much Polish. Although when my mother grew up there, she spoke Polish, and there were some Ukrainians, but Polish was more dominant because it then was part of Poland. Yes, yes, I did. And if you want to take a trip like this, my best advice is to hire somebody to let them do research for you. As long as you're going to go that far, dig up as much as they can in advance.
Well, we have plenty of time for you to visit, and we also have, Pam is the seller of the book. And I would really, it was so motivating
Oh, good.
and interesting and well written. So I would highly recommend the book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And as they say in the Jewish tradition, let's eat. I know Nina has food back there.